Chapter 15 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 15. Ah, but forgetting all things, shall I thee? No trace of the fugitive had been discovered, though £50 reward had been offered for his arrest. Only £50 offered by the Treasury. People in the neighbourhood of Ardliston thought it odd that Sir Joseph Higginson had offered no reward. Yet there would be naturally a restraining influence in the fact of family ties. If Marie Arnold was dear as an adopted daughter, her supposed murderer was allied to Sir Joseph by marriage, and he could hardly desire to see a kinsman of his late wife's in the criminal dock. The prevailing belief in Ardliston and at Ellerslie was that the sea had closed over a lunatic murderer, and that the swift end of a terrible story was about the best thing that could have happened. Nobody outside Ellerslie Park had any doubt that Brandon Mountford had killed Marie Arnold in a paroxysm of epileptic fury. The word epilepsy once having been uttered, the solution of the mystery was taken as found. The people who knew the least about that terrible disease and its influence on mind and conduct were the most boldly assertive as to its probabilities of the case, and there was no one in the neighbourhood of Ellerslie to suggest that in a criminal mystery the obvious is always the unlikely. There was a general assurance that the last word of the story had been told. The murderer had been shuffled off the scene of this world to his own and everybody else's advantage. Much suffering and disgrace had been spared to him, and much trouble and loss to time to other people. The sea and the wind had accounted for a man whose continued existence must have been an affliction to himself and a burden to others. The few county people within the influence of Ellerslie looked into their peerages and descanted upon the lucky escape of the Allendales and the Braemars and all their kindred. The poor young man was so highly connected that to have had him tried for murder would have brought annoyance and discredit into half the drawing-rooms in Mayfair, and made dinner-table conversation even more full of pitfalls than it usually is. Those Mountford girls, Sybil Higginson's aunts, and their sons and daughters had married all over the peerage. There was hardly a family of rank that hadn't a Mountford in it. And how terrible an ordeal for that aristocratic clan had Brandon Mountford's trial for murder been in the papers, the question of his lunacy or non-lunacy discussed in leaders and letters, fought over by medical specialists, clamoured about by benevolent busybodies, until the mind of fashionable London became permeated with the idea that the Mountfords were every one of them mad, and to support which thesis stories would be raked up about every Mountford who had ever worn a queer hat or thrashed a valet from time of Queen Elizabeth. Much of this hateful publicity Mr. Mountford's clan had escaped. There had been a great deal of talk about the Ellerslie murder in that part of Cumberland, but the respect felt for Sir Joseph Higginson had exercised a restraining influence over the editors of local newspapers, and the pen of the picturesque reporter had been employed under restrictions. Upon the report of the inquest there had followed the startling news of Brandon Mountford's escape from the gaol, and the chances of his having gotten away from England, or perished with the luckless crew of the Mary Jane, were duly discussed, but after a paragraph or two in subsequent issues, the matter had been allowed to drop, and the local press had done nothing to annoy the good man to whom the proprietors of the two local weeklies had always looked for aid in times of financial strain. But though the press might renounce the privileges of new journalism in the interests of an old friend, there were tongues in the neighbourhood, old womanish tongues, not always owned by old women, which would not forego so fair an opportunity to blacken a millionaire's character, and breathe their venom on his daughter's fair name. And these tongues were busy, and these small gentry, dwelling in secluded places, afar from the burning questions of public life, were not to be deprived of their prey. In the whist club, on the tennis ground, and at many tea tables, Brandon Mountford and Sibyl Higginson and the murdered girl were the subject of low-voiced conversations, where a shrug and the nod and the half-expressed thought went a great deal further than plain speech. Sir Joseph Higginson let them talk, or knew not that they were talking. Marie Arnold was lying in her grave on the landward side of Ellerslie Church, screened from the bleak wind that blows up from the Solway Firth, after one of those terrible funerals which are always awarded, heaven knows why, to a murdered victim. People had crowded to Ellerslie from busy towns and from far-off villages to follow the murdered girl to the churchyard, and to stare at her mourners, concentrating their attention upon Sir Joseph's haggard face and grey hair, and inclined to resent the absence of his young daughter, who should have been a feature in the show. That hideous funeral, with the rabble to whom the horror of Marie's doom served as a zest to picnic basket and an excuse for an outing, was over, and had been over for nearly 3 months, during the greater part of which time Sir Joseph and his daughter had been in Germany. He had fled from the scene of the murder directly after the funeral, and Sibyl had gone with him. For her, too, Ellerslie had become a place of bad dreams. The gardens and the wood she had loved so well were now clouded with a vague horror. She dared not even think of the spot where the body had been found, where Brandon had been arrested with blood-stained hands. Her maid, Ferriby, had insisted on describing the exact spot, had wanted to take her mistress there, with the tactlessness of her kind. It was an infinite relief to Sibyl to leave England, and she was grateful to her father for proposing to take her to Schwalbach as soon as Miss Minchin could be recalled from her holiday. It was not so agreeable to her feelings to hear next morning that Hubert Urquhart was to be of the party. He had offered to go as a kind of gentleman courier to take all trouble off Sir Joseph's hand. Your valet is English to the 40th power, and will be very little use to you in any excursioning, he said. Sir Joseph protested that he was not going to excursionize. He was going to the quietest place he could find, just to get himself and Sibyl away from the house that was full of agonizing associations. He wanted no one but his old servant and good little Minchin to take care of Sibyl. They would live retired from the world, till the memory of that dreadful night had lost something of its haunting power, and they could venture home again. To stick in one spot and brood over the past is a way to remember and not forget, remonstrated Urquhart. You and Sibyl will come back to Ellerslie in lower spirits than when you went away. Come, Sir Joseph, be reasonable. This shocking event has pulled you down. You'll want a friend at your elbow. Sir Joseph was not in a condition to argue about anything. His brain felt dazed and dull. He let Urquhart think and act for him. And Sibyl, seeing him so broken down, aged in appearance by 10 years, had not the heart to oppose his wishes, or even tell him that Urquhart's company would be a burden to her. So they started for Schwalbach with Urquhart and Miss Minchin and 2 servants, Sir Joseph's faithful valet of many years' service, and Sibyl's maid Ferriby, who was utterly incapable of looking after her young mistress's luggage, and in constant peril of being left behind at railway stations or losing herself in strange cities. Fortunately, little Miss Minchin was equal to the occasion and took care of mistress and maid. Her period of service was nearly at an end. This was perhaps the last journey she and her beloved pupil were to take together, the last time they were to be together as pupil and governess, and her affection was intensified by the prospect of parting. "Whatever shall I do with myself without my darling girl?" she sighed. "You'll have other darling girls, Mousie dear, better girls than me, perhaps." "Oh, no, dear, I shall have no more pupils. Your good, good father is going to allow me £50 a year for the rest of my days, and I am going back to Beverley, to my dear old mother, to be a help and a comfort to her in her declining years. There was never such a man as Sir Joseph, I think, since this world began. He is all that is dear and good, but isn't it a bit too much for you to do, dearest Minchin? Why, if it wasn't for all the care you took of me, I should hardly be alive." She checked herself with a deep sigh, thinking how much heartache an early death might have saved her. They stayed at Schwalbach in spite of Mr. Urquhart's remonstrances. Neither Sir Joseph nor his daughter were in the spirits for touring. Neither mountain scenery nor medieval architecture offered any attraction for them. The minds of both were brooding on the past, and the thoughts of each were alike gloomy. Day followed day in dull monotony, week followed week, and still there was no sign from Brandon Mountford to show that he lived. If he landed and left England for some foreign part, it is very cruel of him to not relieve my mind of this horrible uncertainty, Sibyl said to Urquhart on one of those rare occasions when she spoke to him confidentially. "I have no belief in his escape. I believe he went down in the fishing boat with the rest of them, and be assured that if the sea closed over him, Providence was kind to us all." "I don't believe that he was drowned," said Sibyl obstinately. "He may have sailed for the Cape, and I shall hear from him by and by. No, I will not believe that he is dead." "My dear enthusiast, and to think that you had only known him for 3 weeks." There was a covert sneer in the words and the tone, which passed unnoticed by Sibyl. She attached no importance to this man's ideas or opinions. He had behaved well upon the whole during those long, dull weeks at Schwalbach. He had been useful to Sir Joseph, useful and companionable, and for that Sibyl was grateful. She was still more grateful to him for not having forced his society upon herself. He had not waylaid her in her rambles with sturdy little Miss Minchin, or intruded on her quiet evenings of study in her own sitting-room. He had tried sometimes to lure her from her seclusion, and had been occasionally successful in organising a drive to some distant point of interest, but however picturesque the scenery, he could see that her thoughts were otherwhere. He had never succeeded in making her forget Brandon Mountford. Yet he did not despair of reaching that golden goal to which all his efforts since Marie's death had been tending. "It's a waiting race," he said to himself on that last night at Schwalbach, as he paced up and down the hotel's terrace in the grey interval between sunset and moonrise. "But the prize is such a glorious one. A man may well be patient, buoyed up by such a hope. A lovely woman in the bloom of girlhood, and a dower of $1 million or two. Yes, it's a question of millions. Jabberwock, who writes the money article in the Outside Broker, told me that Sir Joseph Higginson is one of the richest men in the north of England, and will leave a big pile behind him when he hands in his cheques. And he has only this girl, only this one ewe lamb. The stakes are stupendous." It was August when Sir Joseph and his party went back to Cumberland, just 3 months after Marie Arnold's death, long enough, with most people, for sorrow to have assumed their milder form, which may last for a lifetime or dwindle by gentle degrees into forgetfulness. In this instant, however, grief had lost little of its intensity, and the return to familiar scenes was full of pain. Both Sir Joseph and his daughter were heroic in repressing all outward signs of sorrow, and the only change in the father was the look of age, which had come upon him with a strange suddenness at the time of Marie's tragic death, together with a marked lessening of that physical energy which, a year ago, had made the active supervision of his estate an amusement and a delight. He handed over the burden of his cares to Andrew Orlebar, and rarely looked at business documents, languidly assenting to everything his secretary proposed. Had Orlebar been of a less incorruptible honesty, the great argosy of Sir Joseph Higginson's fortune might have sprung a leak. The change which grief had wrought in the daughter was less marked, and the outer world might have supposed only that Sybil Higginson was ripening from the light-hearted girl into the thoughtful woman. But Urquhart, who marked her closely, saw that all the gladness had gone out of her young life. She had a look of anxious thought which a wife of 10 years' standing might have had in the absence of an adored husband, a look as of one whose heart is far away. All the amusements and occupations of her life had lost their savour, except only music, that divine art which, of all others, has the power to soothe and even to console, and lift the mind from the actual to the unseen, to suggest, if it cannot reveal, the spiritual joys of a life beyond the grave. Music had been, after religion, Sybil's chief consoler during those dull days of Schwalbach, and now, on returning to Ellerslie, she flew to her piano in the octagon room, where the frescoes on the wall seemed to smile a welcome after the longest interval in which the lovely living face had been absent since those fair ideal faces were painted. The thought of Marie flashed into her mind as she struck the first chord of a pensive voluntary, and she seemed to hear the rich, round notes of the mezzo-soprano thrilling in the opening bars of the Agnus Dei they loved, in that 12th Mass, which, whether by Mozart or not by Mozart, will always be dear to music lovers. Yes, this was home, the familiar home and room where all that art could do had been done to surround everyday life with beauty. Sibyl was glad to be at home again, even although that home was haunted by bitter memories, and the shadow of a vanished form met her at every turn of the garden or the wood, on the moorland or by the river, the shadow of her companion of 7 happy years, the shadow of the man who in a few short weeks had given new colour to her life. Both were but shadows now, one lying in the village churchyard, the other vanished, his fate unknown. As time wore on, Sibyl began to believe with Urquhart that Braddon had gone down with the crew of the Mary Jane. If he were living, he would surely have made some sign. He must have understood that she would be anxious about his fate, or even if he had been so dull of brain as not to sympathise with her feelings, common courtesy would have impelled him to write to the woman who had gone so far out of her way to aid his escape. Gradually, brooding over the work of that dark night, and recalling Urquhart's share in the work, she grew to suspect some hidden motive, and that an evil one, for the part which he had taken. Her suspicions were of the vaguest, for she could imagine no reason for double dealing on his part. Yet, now that Braddon's flight had ended fatally, it seemed to her that no gentleman should have counselled so unmanly a course, and she hated herself for having urged Braddon to act against his own convictions. Yes, it had been a mistake, and a fatal mistake, an error of judgment which had ended in ignominy and death. How much better to have faced the worst. The mystery of Marie Arnold's death might have been solved in the laborious investigation which a trial would have afforded. The keenest intelligence in the land, the quick intellect of the trained advocate, might have been brought to bear upon crime and motive. The clue might have been found, the labyrinth threaded, and the real murderer discovered. By his disappearance, Braddon had left the mystery dark, and his name disgraced. Urquhart ceased to be Sir Joseph's guest after the return from Schwalbach, but he was still a neighbour, as he had established himself for the autumn at Killander Castle, and he rode or drove to Ellerslie so frequently that it seemed to Sibyl as if he might as well live there. She avoided him as much as possible, and spent the greater part of her life in retirement in her morning room, with no companion but the devoted Miss Minchin and Muff, the old collie dog, which had been her faithful adorer from the days of puppyhood, when his youthful spirits had found vent in boisterous gambols and races on the lawns and in the pine wood. He was old and feeble now, and liked best to lie at ease on the lion skin which Braddon Mountford had presented to her in the beginning of their acquaintance, a trophy from the shores of the Zambesi. The governess was to remain with her pupil as a companion and friend till the following spring, when Sibyl's aunt, Lady Selina Mountford, was to assume all the cares of chaperone, and was to conduct the heiress safely through the fiery furnace of smart society to a brilliant marriage. The migration to Arlington Street was to take place in February, and Miss Higginson was to be presented by Lady Braemar in the first drawing-room of the year. The Braemars were established in the family house in Hertford Street, the shabby old house within whose panelled walls Sir Joseph Higginson had wooed and won his wife. Lord Allendale was now a confirmed invalid, and spent his life between Bath and various Bohemian health resorts, ministered to by a valet who was nearly as old as himself. Braemar, the heir apparent, was to all intents and purposes head of the house of Mountford. He was a busy man, a sportsman, fond of racing, fond of all amusements that cost money, and, having very little money to spend, a man always over-occupied, upon whose crowded brain even the most awful episode in the family history, as Braddon Mountford's arrest on a charge of murder, had made no deep impression. He had written to Sir Joseph, expressing horror at the tragedy, and sympathy with the friends of the murdered girl, together with his opinion that Braddon could not have done the deed, or could only have done it in a fit of lunacy. Mother died mad. A very sad history. Nothing bad on the Mountford side. Foolish marriage. Know very little of the young man. This letter, in Braemar's jerky style, natural in a man who conducted his private correspondence chiefly by electric wire, had been the only notice taken of the Ellerslie tragedy by the house of Mountford, which had a happy knack of dropping any member who got into trouble. With such an immense family as ours, if we didn't cut the black sheep, we should always be in the law courts, said the philosophical Braemar. Our time would be taken up in watching Tom, Dick, and Harry through their troubles. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 16. In the grey distance, half a life away. Sir Joseph and his daughter had been at home nearly a month, and the grouse were being slaughtered on the moors. Lord Penrith was at the castle with a small party of shooters, and had ridden over to Ellerslie twice within a week, and on his second visit had lunched alone with Sir Joseph, a visit that had lasted late into the afternoon, the two men strolling up and down the terrace after luncheon, smoking their cigars. Sir Joseph's Infantas and Harry Clays were famous among his friends, and talking confidentially. Urquhart had been at Ellerslie on neither occasion. Indeed, Penrith had made a point of his brother stopping to represent him with the shooters. "I didn't know you cared about Sir J.," said Urquhart sulkily when he heard of the second visit to Ellerslie. "I don't know what you mean by caring. Sir Joseph is a shocking old bounder, but as good as gold, and if one didn't consort with bounders nowadays, one would have to take to a cavern in the desert." "But you are so exclusive," sneered Urquhart, "and you care so little about society. You could afford to do without the bounders." "No doubt I could, in a general way, but I can't afford to do without Sir Joseph Higginson. I like the man, and I like his cigars, and I like his daughter." "Oh," exclaimed Urquhart, with a sudden drop of his lower jaw. "That's the way the land lies, is it?" "Yes," answered Penrith, "that is the way. Have you any objection?" "Objection? Of course not. The younger must give way to the elder. I am no Jacob." Penrith laughed a short, dry laugh as he stepped lightly into his high dog-cart. Poor Hubert. Well, he had had long innings with the heiress, and it was Penrith's turn now. The fortress might be invincible, but putting a woman's fancy out of the question, and it was evident that Miss Higginson had no fancy for Urquhart, the suitor who could offer a coronet must have the better chance. He had found Sir Joseph a broken man. It was less than a year since they had met, and it seemed to him that 10 years of an ordinary lifetime could have made no more marked alteration in the old man's appearance and physique. Penrith knew that in dealing with so shrewd a man as Joseph Higginson, any beating about the bush would be useless. He had not finished his first cigar on this second visit before he came to the point and offered himself as a suitor for Miss Higginson. "My title is one of the oldest in the north of England," he said. "I won't say anything about my estate, for as the bulk of my property is near your own, I dare say you know its value as well as I do. I have suffered, as most people have suffered, from the fall in rents, but not to such an extent as some landowners. I don't pretend by any means to be a rich man, but the Penrith property is a fine property, and only needs the outlay of a few thousands here and there in restoration and improvement. Houses, gardens, parks have gone to seed for the want of ready cash. My house in Berkeley Square, for instance, a house in a walled garden, one of the few old-world houses left in London. My wife might make a very pretty figure in the world if she had a fortune of her own, and still more if she were young and beautiful, as your daughter is. She might be a leading light among the very best." Sir Joseph's wan face brightened. He did not love Lord Penrith. That hard Urquhart manner had always repelled him. But so far as he knew, Penrith was a man of reputable character. Such dark things as had been said of Hubert Urquhart had never in Sir Joseph's hearing been said of the Earl. It was known that he had tried and failed to marry wealth on more than one occasion, but that failure could hardly be considered disgraceful. Sir Joseph wanted a coronet for his daughter. Last year, perhaps, strong in the bold ambition of a self-made man, he might have considered this particular coronet hardly good enough. He might have aspired to ducal strawberry leaves, or at least to rank allied with more prosperous fortunes than that of Penrith. But since that calamity of last May, a weariness of life had come upon him, and he wanted to see his daughter married as soon as possible. He was perfectly frank with his visitor. "Only 6 months ago I was looking forward to Sibyl's first season with a good deal of pleasure," he said. "I loved to think of the splash she would make in society with her fresh young beauty and her expectations. I wanted to see her admired and followed, and to pick the best man among her followers. But I'm not so keen upon next year as I was a little time ago. I'm breaking up, Penrith. I fancy my race is nearly run. I suppose I used to think myself immortal, for I was always castle-building about the future, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren even. I thought I might live to see new generations. God knows what I thought. Ridiculous in a man of 70. Well, that's over, and now I'm anxious to see my daughter settled, as people call it, before the curtain falls. That dark curtain comes down unexpectedly sometimes, especially where a man has worked his brain as I have worked mine. A fibre snaps, and the tale is told." Penrith murmured some soothing remark about a fine constitution, a green old age. "Men live well into the 90s nowadays," he said. "Some men do. I shan't," answered Sir Joseph briefly. "I've had the tap of Constable Death on my shoulder, and the notice to move on. If Sibyl likes you well enough to be your wife, Lord Penrith, likes you as well as her mother liked me when we married, why, I will back your suit, and I will make such a settlement as will secure her fortune against all contingencies, but which will not be illiberal towards you. There shall be margin enough of available capital to restore the family seat and the house in town, and to improve every homestead and cottage and every acreage on your estate. If she can but like you, that's the question." "I hope it may not be impossible for me to win something even better than liking," said Penrith with a stately air. "It ought not to be a hopeless task if the young lady's affections are disengaged, and I take it that in the retirement of Ellerslie she is hardly likely to have met anyone worthy of her notice." No, she is heart whole, I have no doubt," Sir Joseph answered somewhat confusedly. "She was terribly upset at the trouble we had here last May, our poor Marie's death and Mountford's arrest. Mountford is a kind of cousin of my daughter's. A dreadful business altogether. She misses her adopted sister. She has not been the same girl since, and any more than I have been the same man. Neither of us can forget." Penrith looked at him keenly at that mention of Mountford, and then, in a cold, incisive tone, he said, "A shocking business indeed, Sir Joseph. I conclude that there can be no doubt of Mountford's guilt, so far as an epileptic can be held guilty of a crime committed in a paroxysm of his disease." "I don't know about that. Indeed, I am very doubtful. I should never have believed in his guilt if he had not broken out of jail. Till I heard of his getting away like that, I could have staked my life upon his innocence. But if not he, who could the murderer have been? God knows. Some roaming devil who might have murdered her for the sake of her trinkets, a gold bangle, a diamond ring I gave her on her last birthday, and which she always wore. The fact that the trinkets were not taken proves nothing, for the murderer might have been surprised by Brandon's appearance on the scene. They told me he was kneeling by the body, taken red-handed. Anyone who came accidentally upon the spot and touched my poor girl's blood-soaked gown, as I believe Braddon did, would have been red-handed as he was. That proves nothing. The only suspicious circumstance to my mind is his running away. Mighty suspicious. Painful story altogether, Sir Joseph. I am sorry for Lord Allendale and the family. I need hardly say that I am still more sorry for you and your loss of a dependent you are fond of in such a tragic manner. My loss of a dependent. Yes, of whom I was fond. A dependent. I dare say that you have heard people speculate upon the relations between Marie Arnold and me. Penrith shrugged his shoulders in languid assent. People will talk, he said. I am the last to trouble myself about what the world says, in print or by word of mouth. People may have said that I should hardly have been so fond of a mere dependent, and that Marie Arnold must have been my daughter. Ah, that is the kind of thing people always say. Well, in this case they were right. She was my daughter. Penrith bent his head gravely. I am flattered by your confidence and your directness, he murmured. You're entitled to my confidence. There should be no secrets between us if you are to be my son-in-law. There should be no afterclaps, no asking for explanations. You know pretty well what I am myself. You shall hear all there is to be told about Marie Arnold's birth and parentage. Sir Joseph, if this revelation be in the least distressing to you, I must beg you to let the matter rest. I do not seek to pry into your history, nor could a flaw of that kind in the record of your earlier life lessen the respect to which your character and position entitle you, and which you must always receive unstintedly from me. Men of the world do not look severely upon such indiscretions. Pray let it pass. No, it will be a relief to tell you. I have been a most miserable man since my poor girl's death. I am not superstitious, but sometimes I think that her cruel death was a judgment upon me. I ought to have recognised her as my daughter. It would have been easy enough, my dear wife being gone, to assert a previous marriage. Sibyl would never have disputed the fact, and Marie could have been told to hold her tongue as to the date of her mother's death. I ought to have given my girl her rightful position as my daughter, not my heiress, but my amply dowered daughter. But I was a hypocrite and a coward. I allowed myself to be talked about as the benefactor of an orphan. I allowed my own flesh and blood to wear the livery of dependence. Well, the story is short and common enough. There was a pause, and Sir Joseph walked the length of the terrace in silence, lighted a cigar, smoked a few whiffs, and tossed it away impatiently. Arnold was an Englishman who had worked in northern France for a good many years, and had married a French wife. She was from the south, a lovely creature, and had been married for only a year when her husband came to me as an overseer of ironworks, which I had taken over from a bankrupt company. There had been folly, ignorance, neglect, and dishonesty. Everything was in confusion, and Arnold, who knew the district and the men, and who was half a Frenchman by long habit, was very useful to me. He was a man of remarkable talent, and had been able to hold his own in various employments, but was a drunkard, and before he had been in my service 3 months, I was told that he beat his pretty young wife, and I was asked to interfere for her protection. Well, I called at their lodging, saw the wife, lectured the husband, held out hopes of promotion, and promised to do my very best for him if he would only keep away from the brandy shop. He, on his part, promised amendment, and was very plausible, and praised the virtues of his wife. And naturally broke his promise before long, put in Penrith, whose languid air suggested he was listening rather out of politeness than from any warm interest in the story. Yes, he went from bad to worse. He was a valuable servant, knew the place and the plant, and where all had been chaos, his knowledge and experience were particularly useful. But he was not a fit man to be in a post of authority, and there were continual complaints. I threatened dismissal, but did not dismiss him. I saw his wife, and tried to bring her influence to bear upon him. But she was not a clever managing woman. She was pretty, and flung herself upon me for protection in her helplessness, complained of his violence, regretted her happy home in the South. Her people were poor, but they had always been kind. With her husband she was often in fear for her life. I urged her, things being as bad as this, to go back to her family. I offered to send her home, but she was timid and irresolute. If she were to leave George Arnold, he would follow and bring her back, and her position would be worse than ever. I could do nothing. Another pause, another cigar lighted and flung away, and then Sir Joseph went on hurriedly. The crisis came one summer evening, just as it was growing dark. Arnold had been drinking all day, drinking and leaving his work to be done by a subordinate. I was afterwards told that he had not been sober for a week. There was a desperate scene, and his wife fled from him, came to my lodgings, and asked me to shelter and protect her. Well, Lord Penrith, you know what usually happens in such a case as that. She stayed with me. It was rather for fear of him than love of me that she stayed, I believe. It was only with me that she felt herself safe. As the owner of the works, and as a rich man, I was looked up to, and she fancied herself safer with me than with anybody else. George Arnold came to my lodgings on the following day, only half sober, threatening and violent, and I flung him out of doors like a dog. What pity could I have for a man who had taken a young lovely creature into his keeping, and then had ill-used her from the very beginning of their married life? I had no pity, no compunction where he was concerned. But it was an awful thing to hear the next morning that he had been killed on the railroad, and that it was more than likely that he had thrown himself in front of the train. No one knew that his wife had been under my roof at the time of his death. I provided a new home for her in a village 3 miles from the works. I did all I could to save her character, and I believe I succeeded. No one ever said that Louison Arnold was more to me than an ill-used woman whom I had befriended. But she was fond of me, poor girl. Her heart turned to me in her loneliness, and for half a year after her husband's death, she and I were all the world to each other, and all my leisure hours were spent with her. I made her the promise which, I suppose, most men would have made in such circumstances. I promised to marry her, and I meant to keep my promise. Later on, after the birth of her child, but she had an unhappy disposition, fretful, exacting, jealous, and the bond of love had worn very thin before my daughter was born. The child's coming might have strengthened the tie, and I might have kept my promise like an honest man, but Louison's conduct at this time was trivial and foolish. I discovered a flirtation with one of my clerks. I was very angry, and took her back to her native town in Provence at an hour's warning, and established her with her child in the house which she inhabited for the rest of her life. I allowed her a comfortable income, and I paid for her daughter's education at a convent near the mother's home. But I never saw her after my marriage. Love had long died out, and I could have approached her almost as a stranger, but I felt that to look upon the face of the woman who had been my mistress would have been an offence against my wife. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 17. What People Said. Sir Joseph was pleased with Lord Penrith's quiet manner, both in advancing his own claims and in receiving that frank confession of past error. There was some touch of comfort for the sinner in Penrith's tranquil acceptance of the story as a mere matter of course, an incident likely enough to happen in every man's life. He himself had been inclined to take a tragical view of the old story, and to recognise the scourge of the Furies in those sharp strokes with which fate had dealt him. First, George Arnold's suicide, for which he had never doubted that the drunken husband had flung away his life in a fit of jealous rage. Then Lady Lucy's death, by an accident so common, but a blow so crushing to the man who adored her. And last and most terrible, the murder of his unacknowledged daughter. A remorseful conscience perceived in these calamities the judgment of an offended heaven. It was a comfort, therefore, to talk to a man of Penrith's advanced school, who did not believe in angels, avenging or otherwise, and who looked upon man as the creature of circumstances and environment. Sir Joseph wanted to see his daughter married, settlements made, his colossal fortune secured so far as legal defences can secure wealth against the weakness or the folly of a wife or the dishonesty of a husband. The thought that this splendid fortune could be scattered and wasted was madness. This fortune, which had grown under his care, from the first earnings of the peasant lad to the wealth of the man who owned property of almost every shape and form, stretching from mines and smelting works close at hand to the furthest limits of mining enterprises in America and Australia. It would be a grand thing to see his daughter a countess with an impregnable marriage settlement. The conviction that his working day was nearly done had been growing upon him ever since Marie's death. He felt the shadows darkening round him. He had worked his brain with relentless activity, and of late there had been moments of trouble and confusion. The vain effort to recall a familiar name, the sudden clouding of ideas, which indicated that the fibres were wearing thin, and that the final obscuration, the fall of the curtain, might come suddenly. He was inclined, therefore, to assist Penrith's suit with all his paternal influence. Why should not Sibyl like this aristocratic suitor? He had all the markings of an ancient race in the refined features and slender yet athletic form, the small hand and tapering fingers, the narrow arched foot, a true Norman type, with its suggestions of more distant ancestors in the dim remoteness of centuries before the Conquest. The difference in their ages was considerable. The girl only 18, the man between 30 and 40, arrived at an age when a man begins to feel that the glory and freshness of youth have departed, and that he is nearing the crest of the hill the other side of which is all downward travelling. But this seniority should only lend dignity to his suit. It ought to be more gratifying to a girl's pride to be admired and esteemed by a man of Penrith's age and intellectual weight than to be worshipped by a stripling fresh from Christchurch or Sandhurst. It was a bitter disappointment to Sir Joseph when, after confiding Penrith's hopes and his own views to Sibyl, he was met by a deliberate refusal. "I don't think I shall ever marry," she said. "At any rate, there is nothing further from my thoughts at present. I want to stay with you, dear father, always." "Always may not mean very long," Sir Joseph muttered moodily, and then he strongly urged the advantages of a marriage with Penrith, an old peerage, an estate adjoining that which she was to inherit, a castle that had stood like a rock against the assaults of Scottish freebooters in the day when it was a perilous thing to live on the marches. For dignity, for historic interest, there could be hardly a finer match. Sir Joseph grew angry as he noted Sibyl's scornful lip and resolute eye. "Do you want to marry a duke?" he exclaimed. "Is that why you turn up your nose at an offer most girls would snap at?" "I don't want to marry at all, father." "No, not this year, but next year you will be in London, surrounded by adventurers, and first fortune-hunting scamp, rake-hell or gambler, who takes your fancy will have a better chance than Penrith, with his 30,000 acres and ancient name." "I am not afraid of fortune-hunters." "Very likely not, but I am." "Don't take me to London, then, next year or any other year. I don't care for society, father. I am as happy as I ever can be, here with you." "Sibyl, that's all very well, but it can't last. I'm an old man, and our last parting, my dear, may come sooner than you expect. You think it nothing to give up society and all the pleasures to which my daughter has a right, but that's only because you don't know what the great world is like. You've heard it abused, the pleasures called Dead Sea fruit. That's all nonsense. It's a very pleasant world for youth and wealth, whatever it may be for the worn out and the needy. No doubt they taste the dust and ashes, but the fruit will be fresh and sweet to your lip. You must take your position in society next season, Sibyl, married or unmarried. Your Aunt Selina would not hear of your presentation being delayed after your 19th birthday." Sibyl did not dispute this point, but she was firm in her refusal of Lord Penrith. He was to come to Ellerslie in a few days to hear her verdict. He had begged that she might not be hurried in her decision. He wished that she should have ample time to consider the manifold advantages he had to offer. He would have been cut to the quick had he had known with what indifference Sibyl contemplated his offer, and that the only words of her father's that had touched her feelings had been his gloomy foreshadowings of his own death. Her thoughts were full of sadness as she walked up and down the terrace where only a few months ago she had been so light-hearted and happy. It was still early in September, and autumn had scarcely touched the foliage in park or woods. Only September, and she remembered herself as she had been last spring, when the leaves on yonder plane tree were unfolding, while the beech buds were still purple. How happy, how thoughtless she had been in those lengthening April days, amused with the various trifles, and now it seemed to her as if life were one load of care. Look where she would, the horizon was dark. She had lived almost in seclusion since her return from the Continent. The few cottagers, fisher families at Ardliston, pitmen's families nearer home, whom she had visited, had received her, as she thought, somewhat ungraciously. There was a change of some kind, a want of cordiality. They had answered all her questionings as to their own welfare, and had accepted her gifts with a certain sullenness. She had avoided Susan Kettering, shuddering at the memory of the widow's frantic vehemence on the day of mourning. But 2 or 3 days after Penrith's second visit to Ellerslie, she called on Mrs. Kettering's aunt, the widow Garforth, and again offered to help the orphan children. The aunt declined all help in the niece's name. "It's poor Susan's whim to do without your help, miss," she said, "and she must have her own way. She's just a heart-broken creature, and right or wrong she lays her grief at your door, and she says she'd rather see those children starve than touch a sixpence of your money. They needn't starve anyway, poor bairns, for Susan can earn a little with charing. She's been working up at the Arms 4 days a week, and there's others, aunts and uncles, to help a bit, so there's no call for you to take it to heart, miss, whatever folks may say." "I care nothing what people say," Sibyl answered haughtily. "I only want to help those poor children. I cannot be in the slightest measure responsible for their father's death. He was asked to take out his boat, and offered a price for his night's work. He was free to refuse if he saw any risk." "Of course he was, miss. Everybody can see that, except Susan. She raves about the money that tempted him. Your money. I don't believe he ever had the chance of earning so much in all his life till that night. He refused at first then. Yes, poor fellow. He saw there was dirty weather coming. He didn't mean to make his boat out to that tide, but it was a heap of money to earn in a single night, and Mr. Urquhart put it to him it would be the making of his fortune, and it might save Mr. Mountford from the gallows. And when Susan heard of the money, she begged him to go. That's what preys upon her mind, miss. But she has no call to lay the blame at your door, and set people talking." Those phrases of Mrs. Garforth's about what people said haunted Sibyl's memory with uncomfortable persistency. What should people say to her discredit? And what reason had she to be ashamed, even if all that could be known about that dreadful night were known to the little world of Ellerslie and Ardliston? She could understand that the widow might be blindly resentful, but what right had other people to blame her? There was no act of hers upon that night of which she felt ashamed, for the violation of the law at which she had assisted did not trouble her conscience. She saw no more shame in that than the lion-hearted Winifred Nithsdale could have seen in the trick that saved her husband's head from the block. What could people say? The neighbours at Ellerslie were of the fewest, for, except Killander Castle, there was no country seat within a radius of 10 miles, the greater part of the land within that radius being owned by Lord Penrith and Sir Joseph Higginson, a retired colonel of Highland regiment, with his wife and daughters, and an evangelical vicar and his wife, both middle-aged people, were Sibyl's only genteel neighbours within walking distance, and these two families provided enough gentility to keep a whole parish going. What could people say? Sibyl asked herself with troubled brow as she paced the terrace where so much of her life was spent in fine weather, while the horses were idle in the stable and the boats lay unused in the boathouse by the river, that river which she had never willingly looked upon since Marie Arnold's death. What could people say? She remembered now a certain touch of patronage in the manner of Mrs. Denton, the vicar's wife, a sort of poor dear air, a soothing look and tone which seemed to say, "I shall always be your friend, however other people may treat you." She had thought nothing of that indefinite change at the time, too weary of mind and heart to be on the alert for shades of meaning in Mrs. Denton's local twaddle. But now, recalling that last tea-drinking, she remembered that there had been a change. Those fulsome flatteries which had implied that Sir Joseph's daughter was only a little lower than the angels had given place to a pitying tenderness of tone, insufferable to think of now that she had taken the trouble to recall it. She remembered, too, that there had been a shade of coldness in Mrs. McFarlane's manner when they met in a pitman's cottage, the elder lady distributing tracts and good advice, the younger orders for soup and wine. She remembered that the McFarlanes, who had always been precise to pernickettiness in the interchange of afternoon calls, had not called at Ellerslie since her return from Schwalbach. Sibyl had not noticed the omission till now, thankful to be left in her melancholy solitude, but now it seemed to her that her neighbours had been purposely distant. She went to the terrace to the drawing-room, where an open piano and a volume of Beethoven offered that form of consolation which always soothed her nerves and lifted her soul out of the abyss of gloom. But today even music seemed to have lost some of its power. She played the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, and then rose and moved slowly about the room, looking at the pictures at the walls, the marble Hebe, coldly white against a background of tall palms, the tables loaded with bric-a-brac, the valuable books piled carelessly on other tables, books that had been chosen mostly for her sake, Sir Joseph ordering any new book or new edition which he thought might please his daughter. How splendid it all was, but how lonely. Sir Joseph lived chiefly in his own rooms, seeing no one but Andrew Orlebar, and only joining his daughter at dinner, and after dinner, when he would ask her to play to him, and sit in melancholy silence while she played. Miss Minchin had gone home to her invalid mother. Lady Selina was in Scotland with the Braemars, but was to arrive at Ellerslie early in October and take up her position officially as Miss Higginson's chaperone till she could be released from that grave duty by Miss Higginson's marriage. Sir Joseph had contrived to convey to her mind that, as she could not presume to offer stipend or pecuniary consideration of any sort to a woman of Lady Selina's social standing, her kindness to her niece would be substantially remembered in his will, on which his sister-in-law had assured him, firstly, that she hoped that he would outlive her, and secondly, that she existed only to be useful to her people, and thirdly, that any little legacy he might be generous enough to bequeath to her would be a most welcome addition to her wretched income. "You know what a struggle it is for the unmarried daughters of a poor nobleman to live like ladies," said Lady Selina. "The wonder is that they manage to live at all." Sir Joseph further conveyed to his sister-in-law that the frocks and millinery which she would require during Sibyl's first season were to be included in Sibyl's bills. "You are too good, my dear Joseph. You won't find me extravagant. 1 or 2 walking gowns, my court gown, and a satin frock or 2, with my own lace, for dances, will carry me through the season. I won't ruin you." Everything had been settled, therefore, and in the meantime Sibyl, who dreaded her aunt's frivolous loquacity, had been thankful to be alone. Till to-day there had been no oppression in the sense of solitude, only an immense relief. But now, by this new light, suggested by Mrs. Garforth's tactless speech, the solitude galled. Was she, Sibyl Higginson, who from her babyhood had been accustomed to the adulation of everybody about her, and had grown unconsciously, without any lessening of her generous impulse and sympathy with others, to regard herself as some sort of personage. Was she to be patronised by a vicar's wife, and cut by a half-pay colonel and his family? The thought was intolerable. The impetuous blood of youth mounted to the fair temples, and when a servant threw open the drawing-room door and announced Mr. Urquhart, Sibyl hardly waited for the door to be shut before she turned to the visitor with indignant vehemence and exclaimed, "Did you know this, Mr. Urquhart? Have you known all along of the cruel things people have been saying about me, here in this place, where they have known me since I was a little child?" She burst into tears, the first she had shed since the interview with Mrs. Garforth. They were tears of anger rather than of sorrow. Bewildered for the moment by this outburst, Urquhart gently questioned the indignant girl, and drew from her all the story of Susan Kettering's insolence, and Mrs. Garforth's hints of scandal, and of Mrs. Denton's compassionate airs, and Mrs. Macfarlane's coldness. Hubert Urquhart was essentially an opportunist, quick to profit by a crisis that could be turned to his own advantage, and in Sibyl's wounded feelings he saw a golden opportunity for the ripening of his own schemes. Until Penrith's appearance on the scene, he had meant to take things very quietly, to wait and watch with the patience of Bruce's proverbial spider. His faith had been large in the opportunities that time always brings, but Penrith's rivalry altered the whole aspect of the case, and his only chance of success was a coup de main. "My dear Sibyl, I am sure you have too unenlightened a mind to be distressed by village gossip," he began deprecatingly. "They have talked about me, then?" "Of course they have talked. People talked about Joan of Arc. And there were slanders about Charlotte Corday. Nothing romantic or heroic can escape being talked about. Your visit to the lock-up and your help in Mountford's escape got known somehow, and naturally people have talked. There's not much to be said, no ground for scandal, but the people in the country places have a way of saying things. Miss Higginson must have been very attached to Mr. Mountford before she could take such a step, and then they go harping on about your attachment, and weaving a web of lies round a small nucleus of truth, until the thing grows into a scandal, and mothers shake their heads and say they would not like their daughters to behave as Miss Higginson behaved, and fathers say that Braddon Mountford was a scoundrel, and stories so circumstantial as to seem true are told of Sir Joseph's anger and your tears, and speeches that were never spoken are quoted and commented upon. There is nothing that grows so quickly as a scandal. There needs but a grain of seed to produce a mighty tree, and all the carrion crows of the neighbourhood flap their wings and croak and scream among its branches. But what need you care? You know the purity of your own motives." "Yes, I know my own motives, and his noble character. But it is too cruel that he should be maligned. I can answer to my God for what I did, if I broke the law. It is hardly much the branch of law these people talk about as a departure from the conventional rules that hedge around a young lady in your position. Forgive me if I wound you by repeating their malicious speeches, the running after your lover." He tried to put as much unpleasant emphasis on that last word as it would carry, but to Sibyl's innocence the word meant very little. She understood, however, that unkind things had been said, unkind to him whose fate she knew not, and whose memory she fondly cherished. "Sibyl, There is one and only one way of cutting through the web that entangles you. The quickest, simplest way, he said, eagerly drawing nearer to her with a sudden fire in his cold, hard face, taking her hand in both his own. Give me the right to defend your reputation. I was with you all through that night. I can answer for the purity of your motives, the generous impulse that urged you to depart from the beaten path of conduct. No one will dare to speak ill of you when you have a husband to answer for you, a husband familiar with your life from your childhood, who knows it is spotless. Give me that right, Sibyl. Give me the reward of my patient love. No, 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 not for the world, she said passionately. How can you dream of such a thing, knowing what you know? Do you think I am so fickle or so weak? You know I loved Braddon Mountford, and that it was only his sad affliction that forbade our being engaged lovers. The past is the past. You can never marry Mountford. Dead or living, he is lost to you. But marriage is your only escape from the scandal that has grown out of that fatal night. Sibyl, for your own sake, I must be plain with you. I know the world of which you know nothing, know it too well, and I know that the cloud which darkens your name in this place will follow you to London, and that your first appearance in the great world will be overshadowed by that odious scandal, vague from its very vagueness, impossible to confute. You cannot live down that scandal by yourself alone. It will be the signal for the basest adventurers to hunt you as their destined prey. No one but a husband, a man of position, can come between you and the venom of the place in which beauty and wealth are the chosen mark for malice. Is that so? Asked Sibyl suddenly. Would these people be sorry for their unkindness if I were to marry a man of position in their paltry world? A man of rank? Assuredly they would, said Urquhart, his face lighting triumphantly. She had wrenched her hand from his, and in this moment of fancied success he tried again to seize it, tried to draw her to his breast, fully believing that his cause was won much more easily than he had hoped, even when resolved on trying to take her by storm. She repulsed him angrily. Her face was flushed. Her eyes flamed. She ran to the hall and held the button down till a footman appeared. Was that Lord Penrith's phaeton which drove past the window half an hour ago? She asked. Yes, ma'am. His lordship is with Sir Joseph in the study. Ask him to come to me here directly. Sir Joseph, ma'am? No, Lord Penrith. What do you want with my brother? Asked Urquhart when the man was gone. You shall hear. Sibyl was walking about the room, her heart beating violently, her breath quickened, her hands clasped tightly together in the agony of a desperate determination. She was at the age when the happiness of a lifetime is sometimes hazarded upon the impulse of a moment, the age of sudden resolve and reckless action. Wounded pride had mastered every other feeling. Penrith appeared, pale, grave, prepared for a serious interview, but in no wise prepared for his brother's presence. He gave Urquhart a curt nod as he approached Sibyl. Their hands met, and he sat looking at her, surprised at the crimson flush on her cheek and the angry light in her eyes. You sent for me, and I came with delight, he said gently. I'm sure you know how eager I am to see you, but you look distressed. I fear there is something the matter. He turned from Sibyl to Hubert questioningly. Lord Penrith, my father told me a few days ago that you wished me to be your wife. Do you still wish it? Still, always, with my whole heart. But perhaps you don't know that people in this neighbourhood have said unkind things about me because I helped Mr. Mountford to escape, convinced that he was innocent of poor Marie's death. I've heard nothing. If I did hear, well, I should let people know of my opinion of them for daring to speak unkindly of you. But you know I broke the law in helping Mr. Mountford to escape, that I provided the money which tempted the owner of the Mary Jane to risk his life. The boat was lost with all on board. They say at Ardliston that those lives lie at my door. She clasped her hands before her face to hide the tears that rushed to her eyes at that thought. I know that you can have done nothing that was not noble and high-minded. I loved him, faltered Sibyl. I am not ashamed of my love. Even now, I can never care for anyone on this earth as I cared for him. But if, she continued, dashing away her tears and confronting Penrith with a resolute look, if, knowing this, which I have told you in the presence of your brother, who was with me and acted for me on that fatal night, if, knowing this, Lord Penrith, if you still wish to take me for your wife— still wish, earnestly, passionately, cried Penrith, seizing her hands and trying to draw her to his breast. There was triumph, ecstasy almost, in his face and voice, if not the ring of real passion. To have won her, to have won beauty, youth, and fortune so easily was more than he had hoped. He flashed an exultant glance at his brother as he put his arm around Sibyl's waist. "My love, my wife," he cried, "life has nothing left to give me more than this." Hubert Urquhart had been standing a little way off, with his back to a wide window, a window with plate glass doors opening on to the terrace, a window which gave light and brightness and air and egress and ingress, but which every aesthetically minded visitor at Ellerslie condemned as an error in taste. Standing with his back to that flood of light, Urquhart's face had been in the dense shadow, and neither the diabolical scowl nor the livid hue of his countenance as he witnessed this impromptu betrothal had been noticed by his brother or Sibyl. Both were startled by the venom which hissed from his lips in a burst of ironical felicitation. "I congratulate you, Miss Higginson, on a coup de théâtre that would have done honour to Rachel in her zenith, a dramatic situation more daring than anything Sardon has ever attempted. You wanted a husband to patch up your damaged reputation. That fact was clear to me just now when I offered you my unworthy self and a younger brother's modest status. But you are more ambitious than I thought you. I did not know that you wanted to repair your blemished character with the prestige that hangs about an earl's coronet, that you counted upon buying a title with the $1,000,000 or so which your worthy, coal-mining, iron-founding, muddy-grubbing father is ready to give as a solution to the husband who is willing to marry." Some word followed, only half pronounced between clenched teeth, only the beginning of some infamous word, no syllable of which ever reached Sibyl's ear, and which ended in a crash of plate glass that rang through Ellerslie House, and brought master and servants, indoor and out of door, hurrying to the scene. Happily for Hubert Urquhart, and perhaps still more happily for Lord Penrith, the heavy glass doors were standing ajar. With one blow, impelled by passion too strong for speech, the elder brother hurled the younger backwards through the parting casements and onto the terrace outside. It was the shock of the doors flying asunder as Urquhart fell between them, which had shattered the two tall panels of glass and sent a shower of splinters flashing and sparkling in the sunlight. The flush of anger had faded from Penrith's forehead by the time Sir Joseph entered the room, and he met the baronet's eager questioning with perfect self-possession. "I am sorry I lost my temper and broke your window," he said. "But if a scoundrel insults the woman one loves, or indeed any woman, what can one do but knock him down? And Mr. Urquhart happened to be standing in front of your window. Pray don't be distressed, Sibyl. You will never again be subjected to my brother's brutality, for he shall never enter any house of mine, and I'm sure your father will have nothing more to do with him." "What has he done? What has he said?" asked Sir Joseph, bewildered and alarmed. "Nothing worth talking about. Only an explosion of malevolence. He wanted to marry Miss Higginson, and behaved like a lunatic when he heard her promise to be my wife." "What? Has she promised?" "I am proud to say she has," answered Penrith, taking Sibyl's hand. "Thank God," said Sibyl's father. While this brief conversation was proceeding, Hubert Urquhart was lying on his back upon the gravel walk outside, unconscious of surrounding things. Dr. Dewsnap, who looked to his injuries half an hour later, was able to assure Sir Joseph that, although his patient was suffering from slight concussion of the brain, and was somewhat shaken and bruised by the fall, he would most likely be quite well in a few days. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 18, Lady Penrith's Idea. The story of Sibyl Higginson's girlhood has been told. She now reappears on the scene in the maturity of her beauty, in the calm strength of a cultivated intellect, with all the power and influence that rank and wealth can give in a world where both are objects of fanatical worship. A woman much admired and courted, and sincerely loved by the numerous nephews and nieces to whom she is never weary of showing kindness. Yet, for all that, a lonely woman, childless, fatherless, living her own life, unsustained by the sympathy or affection of her husband. Sir Joseph's anticipation of the end proved a true forecast. He died suddenly at his house in London in the first year of his daughter's marriage, and after seeing her take her place in the great world with distinction and the vast wealth which he had accumulated in half a century of laborious enterprise, passed at once to Sibyl, Countess of Penrith, guarded and hedged round by those wise restrictions which Sir Joseph's lawyers had attached to her marriage settlement. Sibyl's fortune might make Lord Penrith a rich man, but Lord Penrith had no power to make his wife a pauper. Sometimes in an angry mood he spoke of himself contemptuously as her ladyship's pensioner. The house at Arlington Street was sold soon after Sir Joseph's death, and according to the terms of the will, but all that was choicest in a remarkable collection of pictures and curios was transferred to Lady Penrith's rooms in Berkeley Square, or to the castle in the Marches. She was pleased to surround herself with the things her father's taste had selected, nor was she unwise in the desire to keep the pictures which he had chosen, for the self-educated, humbly born millionaire had early learnt to discriminate between good and bad art, and his taste and judgment had ripened in the studios of famous painters and in Christie's sale rooms. Even the sweepings of his gallery sold well. No ray of light had been cast on Brandon Mountford's fate in the 10 years that had gone by since his escape from the lock-up at Ardliston, and Sibyl could hardly doubt that he had gone down to his death with the crew of the Mary Jane. Susan Kettering's children were growing up to sturdy lads and lasses, and it had been Lady Penrith's care that they should be well provided for. The boys apprenticed, the girls started in domestic service with all the belongings of respectability. Susan Kettering had long ago repented of her unjust anger against Sir Joseph's daughter, and had learnt to be grateful to the benefactress who had made the years of her widowhood smooth and prosperous. There was no one in that north country more beloved and respected than Lady Penrith. She was a personage in Mayfair and Belgravia, but in that smaller world around Killander Castle and Ellerslie Park, she was a queen. Ellerslie House had never been occupied by strangers, though in the 9 years since Sir Joseph's death, Lady Penrith had only lived in it for a few days at a time, once or twice a year. His lordship spoke scornfully of the folly of maintaining a house and grounds which required the labour of about a dozen people for such brief occupancy. But Sibyl reminded her husband that as the shooting and fishing were of use to himself and his friends, he had no right to complain. There was at least one inhabitant of Ellerslie House above the status of a servant, and that was Andrew Orlebar, who had occupied his old rooms and moved about house and gardens and home farm in his own quiet way ever since Sir Joseph's death. He was Lady Penrith's land steward and business manager. He held all the threads of that golden web of which she was the centre. He knew the value of every investment Sir Joseph had ever made, and he had watched them all from the beginning. And he might have been questioned at any moment as to yesterday's closing price of any stock held by Lady Penrith without being out in his reply by so much as an eighth. Andrew Orlebar lived at Ellerslie all the year round, and never complained of wintry weather or want of society. He was much respected in the district, and looked up to as a man whose advice on money matters was worth a little extra courtesy. He was nearly 70, but no less active and industrious than when he entered Sir Joseph Higginson's service as a timekeeper and clerk at 30. Nothing at Ellerslie had been altered. The rooms in which Sibyl's childhood and youth had been spent were exactly the same as she had ever known them, and it pleased her sometimes to turn her back upon a large house party at the castle to spend a quiet day in those silent rooms, with no companion but Andrew Orlebar, with whom she would take tea in Sir Joseph's study, and who delighted to make her look through his account at the half-year's payment to her banker. "You have a surplus from last year's income that ought to be invested," he would say. "Your balance is needlessly large." "Do what you like with it, my dear Andrew," was her usual reply. "Your investments never go wrong. But first let us remember the poor." And then she would tell him of some charity in which she was interested, some great work vouched for by good men, and she would allot to that scheme of beneficence perhaps the whole of her surplus. If Andrew Orlebar argued that she was giving away too much, that she was not allowing her fortune its natural development, she would answer with a sad smile that she had no motive for being richer, and that she had enough and more than enough, having no children among whom to divide her fortune, no family to establish, spreading out to other families, carrying her riches into new channels. For a solitary woman to go on amassing wealth for the mere pleasure of piling up money would be horrible, she said. Orlebar shook his head dubiously. Great fortunes must grow, he said. It doesn't do for them to stand still. The value of the sovereign steadily dwindles, and a rich man who doesn't increase his capital will find himself a poor man some day, without knowing why. You must really allow me to invest half your surplus in one of our home railways. The stock is very high, but it will go higher. The discussion generally ended in a compromise. Half the surplus income went to the charity, and half was invested in Orlebar's discretion. He was very careful in his administration of his principal's fortune. The days of neck-or-nothing enterprise which had helped make Joseph Higginson a millionaire were over. I go on plodding among investments that cannot bring more than 4.5% at the outside, he said. But the responsibility is too great for me to risk anything. I can't play pitch and toss with tens of thousands, as your dear father did. Ah, those were fine times in Arlington Street, when you were a little girl. He used to take my breath away, but whatever stock he touched always turned up trumps. He had the genius of finance, and it was all for your sake. I am building up a pile for my little girl, he used to say, and he did build up a pile. Those Egyptian pharaohs were thought to have done a grand thing when they left a pyramid behind them. What's the good of a pyramid? It's neither useful nor ornamental. The fortune your father left is both. Look at the Higginson orphanage, the Higginson almshouse for pitmen's widows, the Higginson schools. Aren't those useful? And ornamental, too. Your work, all your work, I know, my dear lady, but you couldn't have built them without his money. No, indeed, they are his work and his only. It has been my greatest happiness to found institutions that will make his name remembered in the years to come, when there will be no one living who can remember him. Ah, that's a sad thought, ain't it? 50 years or so, and there's no one left whose memory can conjure up the figure of the man as he lived. There's a portrait or two, more or less like him. Herkimer's is about as like as paint can be to the flesh and blood, but the memory of him as he lived and moved, the quick turn of his head, all life and energy, the curious little twitch of his eyebrow when he was puzzled, that slow, thoughtful smile when he was going to do a kindness to anyone, his deep, full voice, a little rough sometimes, but very gentle in those he loved. 50 years. And no one on this earth will be able to recall those things that are so near and vivid now. It does seem hard, don't it? Sybil loved to hear the old man talk. Were he never so prosy? And those afternoons at Ellerslie were always a restful change from the statelier life of Killander Castle. Coralie, having expressed herself very anxious to see a house of which she had heard a great deal, Lady Penrith took her over to Ellerslie one October afternoon, within a few days of that long afternoon wasted on futile inquiries in the vain endeavour to solve the mystery of the pencil scrawl. Cora ran about the house, looking at everything, and rapturous about everything, with that equality of praise which bespeaks the ignorant admirer. And while the younger lady was amusing herself by a tour of inspection, the elder was closeted with Andrew Orlebar, from whom she had no secrets, and to whom she showed the scrap of paper which had stirred such hidden depths of feeling. "It is so like his hand," she said. And then she placed the poor scrawl side by side with a little note written in the early morning before one of their river excursions, proposing a picnic luncheon at a particular spot, suggesting that Sibyl and her companion should take their books and sketching materials, or their latest craze in the way of needlework, and make a day of it. A note, sportive and playful, which committed the writer to no expression of feeling, yet which seemed to breathe fondest admiration of her to whom it was written. It was his first letter. How she had treasured it in that golden time, and in all the years since that brief dream of love. Other letters had followed, letters about further excursions, about books, about music, playful little notes written in the morning about disputed points in the conversation overnight, a misquoted line by Tennyson or Browning, notes about anything, about nothing. There is no surer sign of a man being deep in love than this inclination to scribble futilities to a lady while living under the same roof with her. The necessary separations of daily life are too long for him. He must needs bridge them over with nonsense letters. He cannot stand under her window and serenade her like a lover of old romance. So he writes, and writes, and writes. "There is certainly a resemblance between the two hands," said Orlebar, after scrutinizing both documents through a reading glass and magnifying every stroke. "But what of that? You may often find a resemblance as marked in the penmanship of men who are total strangers to each other, and cannot have grown to write alike by unconscious imitation. And how can you for a moment suppose that this scrap of paper given to you by some crazy mendicant on the moor could emanate from Braddon Mountford, who disappeared 10 years ago, and whom we have every reason to believe dead?" "Every reason, but no positive proof," answered Sibyl, thoughtfully. "The man who gave me that paper may have been crazy, but he was certainly not a beggar. He thrust the paper into my hand and ran away. He wanted nothing from me. His conduct was like that of a messenger, an ignorant man who had been told to watch for my carriage and to give me the paper." "And you think he was sent by Mountford?" asked Orlebar, with a pitying smile. The delusions of romantic love know no limits. He knew, partly from his observation of her, partly by her own confession, how fondly this woman had loved Braddon Mountford, and he contemplated her hallucination of to-day with tenderest compassion. Poor child, poor woman, whose life had for the last 10 years been loveless. What wild possibilities an empty heart can conjure out of the thinnest cloud of suggestion. "I don't know what to think. My dear lady, pray don't delude yourself by hopes that are as unreal as those mountain ranges and giants' caverns which you used to show me in the evening sky years ago on the terrace when we walked up and down together after dinner. I don't think any rational person can doubt that poor Mountford went down in the Mary Jane, and that, under the influence of his terrible disease, he committed the crime which brought such misery on this house." "That I will never believe," said Lady Penrith indignantly. No, you won't believe it because you can't understand. You don't know what it is when a devil of madness, blind, desperate, raging against he knows not what, enters into a man and cries, "Kill! Kill!" You can't understand that, nor can I, or any sane person. But we know that such things are, and if it was so, don't you think Providence dealt kindly with all of us in sending that poor fellow to a death that had no shame in it? A moment's wild uncertainty, and then whirled out of this life in one deafening blast, one uplifting of the furious sea. Upon my word, Lady Penrith, since every one of us must die somehow. I doubt if one could die an easier death than in a tempest." "He was innocent, innocent," said Sibyl, her eyes brimming with angry tears. "I know quite as much about it as you do. I have studied the books that describe his malady. A man does not reach that violent stage of the disease all at once. Braddon had suffered from the milder form of attack. He may have had a worse seizure that day, perhaps. He had been agitated and unhappy. He had been anxious and worried for some time previously. The period of unconsciousness was much longer. No doubt it was a bad attack, but the impulse to kill never touched him. I would stake my life upon that. You must look somewhere else for the murderer of Marie Arnold. Somewhere as near, perhaps—" "What do you mean?" "I can't tell you. There are some suspicions too dreadful to be uttered. I dare not tell you mine, but I can and I do declare that Braddon Mountford was no murderer." There was a silence. Orlebar was perplexed and troubled by those dark hints of hers. He was quick to catch at an idea, and the only idea that Sibyl's words suggested was terrible. He would not give it room in his mind. But if this unhappy man were alive, why should he allow all these years to pass without making any sign, without writing to you, to whom he owes so much? He may have been unable, for some cause or another. It is difficult to imagine a cause, and if he were living and a free agent, such silence would imply base ingratitude. No, what I did was nothing. Or it may have been the worst that could have been done. The worst for his good name, certainly, for it confirmed the people about here in the idea of his guilt. I may have fallen into a trap set for him and me. He had no cause for gratitude, and there may be reasons, his regard for my reputation among other reasons, why he should hold no communication with me." "Granted. But in that case, why, after a silence of many years, approach you in such a lunatic fashion as this?" asked Orlebar, pointing to the scrap of paper with those few incoherent words scrawled in pencil. "Must I tell you what I've thought of in the long sleepless nights since the message was given me? It is hateful to speak of it, but I can imagine no other solution. I believe he is somewhere in this neighbourhood, mad and a prisoner." "My dear lady, that is the wildest flight of imagination upon your part." "Perhaps, but that is the only explanation I can find for this." She laid her finger on the pencilled lines before Andrew Orlebar, and then took up the little scrap of paper and put it away in her purse as carefully as if it had been the most precious thing she possessed. "I have begun to look for him," she said quietly, "and I shall go on looking for him." End of chapter 18.